December 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, on the border between Belgium and Germany. They called it the meat grinder. If hell ever froze over, it would look exactly like this. The snow wasn't the gentle kind you see on Christmas cards. It was deep, biting, and treacherous. The wind didn't just blow. It screamed through the pines, carrying the scent of cordite and death. For months, the American and German armies had been butchering each other in these woods. It was the longest single battle the U.S. Army had ever fought, and one of the bloodiest. But tonight was different. It was December 24th, Christmas Eve. In the middle of this frozen nightmare, miles away from the nearest town of Monschau, stood a small, isolated hunting cabin. It was a fragile little thing, made of wood and stone, somehow still standing amidst the artillery barrages. Inside, the air wasn't warm, but it was out of the wind. Elisabeth Vincken sat near the small stove. She was a German mother, displaced by the bombings in Aachen. She had brought her 12-year-old son, Fritz, here, hoping the deep woods would hide them until the madness ended. She looked at Fritz. He was too thin. His eyes were too old for a boy of 12. They were huddling together, trying to pretend that the thumping in the distance was thunder, not howitzers. They had a scrawny rooster named Herman that Elisabeth had been saving. Tonight, she decided, Herman would be their Christmas feast. It wasn't much, but it was an act of defiance against the war. They would have Christmas. The silence in the cabin was heavy. It was a waiting kind of silence. Waiting for the bombs. Waiting for the knock on the door that meant the war had finally found them.
Suddenly, a sound cut through the whistling wind. Knock. 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 It wasn't a loud knock. It was weak. Desperate. Elisabeth froze. Fritz looked at his mother, his eyes wide in the dim lamplight. In these woods, a knock on the door at night didn't mean neighbors with fruitcake. It meant partisans. It meant looters. Or worse, it meant the Gestapo checking papers. Elisabeth motioned for Fritz to stay put. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She walked slowly to the heavy wooden door. She took a breath, steeling herself, and cracked it open just an inch. The wind immediately tried to push its way in. Standing in the snow were 3 spectral figures. They were coated in ice. They wore the olive-drab uniforms of the American Army. The enemy. 2 of them were holding up the third man. He was slumped between them, his face a ghostly shade of gray, blood staining the snow around his boot. He was badly wounded. They weren't monsters. They weren't the propaganda posters she had seen in town. They were just boys. Frozen. Terrified. Dying boys. One of them, a tall, shivering American, looked at her. He didn't raise his weapon. He just looked at her with eyes that begged for a shred of mercy. He spoke in a language she didn't understand, but the tone was universal. Help us. Please.
This was the moment, the pivot point. Elisabeth Vincken was a patriotic German woman. Her husband was somewhere out there, fighting for the fatherland. These men standing in the snow were the reason her country was burning. By the strict laws of war, she should slam the door. By the laws of the Reich, assisting them was treason, punishable by death without trial. She looked past the uniforms. She looked at the wounded boy, hardly older than her own Fritz. She imagined her own son, somewhere in a frozen foreign land, bleeding in the snow, praying for a stranger to open a door. Humanity outweighed patriotism. "Kommt rein," she whispered. "Come in." She pulled the door wide. The 3 Americans stumbled inside, bringing the bitter cold with them. They collapsed onto the floor near the stove. The heat seemed to shock their frozen systems. Elisabeth immediately took charge. The war outside ceased to exist. This was her kitchen, and these were children who needed tending. She ordered Fritz to get more wood. She took the wounded man's leg. It was a nasty shrapnel wound, bleeding heavily. She tore up her best bed sheets to make bandages. She sent Fritz to fetch potatoes to add to the rooster stew. The cabin began to smell of cooking food, a scent so foreign to these soldiers that it almost made them weep. For an hour, there was peace. The Americans, whose names were Jim, Ralph, and Harry, began to thaw out. Ralph, the wounded one, slipped into a feverish sleep. Jim, the tall one, tried to communicate with Elisabeth using basic hand gestures and a tiny German phrasebook. They spoke the universal language of gratitude.
The stew was bubbling. The cabin felt almost normal. Then it happened again. Bang, bang, bang. This wasn't a weak, desperate knock. This was authority. This was a demand. The atmosphere in the cabin shattered. The 2 conscious Americans scrambled for their carbines, their faces hardening instantly from gratitude back into the masks of war. Elisabeth motioned frantically for them to lower their weapons. "Wait!" she hissed. If this was the American patrol looking for their lost comrades, it would be fine. But if it wasn't... Elisabeth walked to the door again. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely work the latch. She opened it. Her blood ran colder than the wind outside. Standing there were 4 men. They wore the gray-green uniforms of the Wehrmacht, German soldiers. They were heavily armed. They were covered in snow, exhausted, and looking for shelter. The corporal in charge looked at Elisabeth. "Wir haben uns verirrt," he said gruffly. "We are lost. Can we rest here until dawn?" Elisabeth stood in the doorway, blocking their view inside. Her mind raced. Behind her were 3 armed American soldiers. In front of her, 4 armed German soldiers. If the Germans stepped inside, it wouldn't be a battle. It would be a massacre in her kitchen. Fritz would see it. She might die in the crossfire. She had to do something, now.
Elisabeth Vincken stepped outside into the snow, pulling the door partially closed behind her. She looked the German corporal in the eye. She didn't see a soldier. She saw another boy who needed a mother's correction. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady and loud over the wind, "you are welcome to come into the warmth. You are welcome to eat our Christmas dinner with us." The soldiers relaxed slightly. Food. Warmth. "But," Elisabeth continued, raising a hand to stop them from moving forward, "we have other guests inside." The corporal frowned. "Who?" "Americans," she said flatly. The soldiers instantly tensed, raising their rifles. The corporal stared at her in disbelief. "Americans? Are you mad?" "Listen to me," Elisabeth snapped, her voice sharp as a whip. "Inside is a boy who is gravely wounded. The others are lost, just like you. They are tired and hungry, just like you." The corporal began to push past her. "This is war, woman! Move aside!" Elisabeth placed both hands squarely on the corporal's chest and shoved him back. It was an insane act of bravery. "It is Christmas Eve here," she declared, her voice shaking, not with fear, but with fury. "There will be no shooting here tonight, not in my house, not on this holy night." She stared them down. 4 armed men against 1 angry mother. "You can leave your weapons outside," she commanded. "The others have already done so. Tonight we are not soldiers. We are human beings breaking bread. Now give me your rifles." The silence stretched. The wind howled. The corporal looked at Elisabeth, then at the closed door, then back at his freezing men. He saw the absolute resolve in her eyes. He knew that if he tried to enter that cabin with his weapon, he would have to go through her first. Slowly, incredibly, the corporal lowered his Mauser rifle. He unbuckled his belt and leaned it against the stone wall of the cabin. He nodded to his men. One by one, they did the same. Elisabeth opened the door.
The 4 German soldiers stepped inside. The cabin seemed to shrink. 7 armed men, formerly armed men, who were sworn to kill each other on sight, were now crammed into a tiny room, smelling the same rooster stew. The Americans were pressed against the far wall, tense as coiled springs. The Germans stood near the door, stiff and awkward. The air was thick enough to choke on. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound was the bubbling pot on the stove and the ragged breathing of the wounded American, Ralph. It was young Fritz who broke the paralysis. He was just a child, less burdened by the hatreds of the adult world. He walked over to the table and started setting out the few mismatched plates they owned. The simple domestic sound of plates clattering on wood broke the spell. Elisabeth moved to the stove. "Sit down," she ordered the room at large. "The potatoes are ready." Slowly, warily, they sat down. They sat mixed together around the small wooden table. An American next to a German next to Fritz. Elisabeth served the stew. It wasn't much, a tough old rooster stretched with potatoes and water. But to these men, it was a feast fit for a king. The German corporal, who had been studying the wounded American, suddenly spoke up. "I was a medical student in Heidelberg before the war," he said in passable English. "May I look at his leg?" The tall American, Jim, hesitated. He looked at Elisabeth. She nodded firmly. Jim nodded to the German. The corporal moved to Ralph's side. He gently unwrapped Elisabeth's makeshift bandages. He examined the angry wound, cleaned it more thoroughly from his own field kit, and rebandaged it with skilled hands. "He has lost blood," the corporal said to Jim, "but the cold probably saved him. It slowed the bleeding. If he rests, he will live." Jim, the American, looked at the German corporal, the enemy who had just saved his friend's life. His eyes welled up. "Thank you," he whispered.
They ate. At first they ate in silence, wolfing down the hot food, their bodies desperate for the calories. But as their bellies filled and the warmth of the stove seeped into their bones, the tension began to evaporate completely. One of the Germans produced a bottle of red wine from his pack, something he had probably liberated in France. He pulled the cork and offered it to the American sitting next to him. The American took a swig and passed it on. The bottle went around the table, crossing the battle lines with every pass. They began to talk. The Germans who spoke English translated for the others. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't talk about politics or Hitler or Roosevelt. They talked about home. Jim showed a crumpled photograph of his girlfriend back in Ohio, standing next to a new Ford automobile. One of the Germans, a jovial older man they called Heinz, wept openly as he spoke of his small farm in Bavaria and the 3 children he hadn't seen in 2 years. They realized something profound in that little cabin, something that the propaganda machine tried so hard to make them forget. They realized they were all the same. They were just men who wanted to be warm, who wanted to be fed, and who desperately wanted to go home and never hold a rifle again. Fritz sat wide-eyed, listening to these strange men laugh and cry together. For a few hours, the monstrous war outside became just a bad dream. Inside the cabin, there was only peace. There was only Christmas. At midnight, Elisabeth stood up. She asked them to join her in prayer.
And there, in the heart of the meat grinder, 7 soldiers and a mother and child bowed their heads. Elisabeth said grace in German. The Americans whispered, Amen. It was the strangest, most beautiful Christmas dinner any of them would ever attend.
The truce lasted as long as the darkness. When the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees on Christmas morning, reality returned. The magic of the night before dissipated with the morning mist. They were soldiers again. The men woke up from where they had slept on the floor. They were stiff and sore, but they were alive. The German corporal looked out the window. The snow had stopped. He turned to the Americans. He pulled out a map from his tunic pocket. "We are here," he pointed for Jim. He traced a line with his finger. "Your lines are over here, towards Monschau. It is maybe 2 kilometers that way." He then pointed in the opposite direction. "My unit is headed this way. If you go that way, you will run into our pickets and you will be killed. Stay in the trees. Head west." Jim nodded, understanding. The German was giving him a safe passage. Elisabeth returned their weapons. It was a tense moment as they buckled their belts back on, the weight of the steel and wood reminding them of their duty. The Germans left first. The corporal shook Elisabeth's hand. "Thank you, Mutter," he said softly. He saluted the Americans, a proper military salute, and then he and his men disappeared into the white forest, heading east. A few minutes later, it was time for the Americans to leave. Ralph, the wounded boy, was now able to hobble with help. Jim stood before Elisabeth. He couldn't find the words. He just took her rough, work-worn hands in his and squeezed them hard. He looked down at young Fritz, ruffled his boy's hair, and handed him a bar of American chocolate from his ration pack, a treasure beyond price in 1944 Germany. "Merry Christmas," Jim said, his voice thick with emotion. Then the 3 Americans walked out into the snow, heading west towards their own lines. Elisabeth and Fritz stood in the doorway, watching until the last olive-drab uniform vanished into the trees. They were alone again. The war was still there. The guns would start firing again soon. But something had changed. Fritz Vincken grew up. He survived the war. He eventually moved to America, opened a bakery in Hawaii, and told this story for the rest of his life. He spent decades trying to find the 7 soldiers who had sat at his mother's table. He found some of them many years later. They were old men by then, but they remembered. They remembered the night in the Hürtgen Forest when the guns fell silent, not because of a treaty signed by generals, but because a single German mother refused to let hatred enter her home on Christmas Eve. Elisabeth Vincken proved that even in the darkest times, in the deepest winter of the human soul, a small light of humanity can still burn bright enough to stop a war, if only for one night.
That story always leaves me speechless. It's a powerful reminder that the labels we put on each other, enemy, ally, foreigner, are so fragile compared to our shared humanity. Elisabeth Vincken didn't see uniforms that night. She just saw sons. So, here's a question for you to think about today. If you were in that cabin, starving, frozen, and armed, looking across the table at the people you were told were your mortal enemies, do you think you could have put down your weapon and broken bread with them? It's a harder question to answer than we might like to admit. If this story touched you,
If it made you think about the power of kindness, even in the worst of circumstances, please consider subscribing to our channel. We are dedicated to bringing you more of these incredible, true stories from history that remind us of what it really means to be human. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care of each other.